Hello, I'm Ivan Light, author of Deadly Secret of the Lusitania, and I'm asked, where did this idea come from? In a way, I was born into it. Yes, born into it. You see, my mother was a World War I widow. How did that happen? Well, she married young in 1932. She married Elliot Huff, whose photograph is here on the right, on my left. And he died in her arms 3 years later of war-caused disabilities. When my father came along several years after that, about 7 years later, she didn't stop remembering Elliot Huff. She always loved Elliot Huff the most. And he was the love of her life, and she had a lot of grief because he died as a young man as a result of injuries sustained during the First World War. And so she was a war widow, and I was raised in the shadow of her grief and anger. Her grief about the death of the man she loved, and also her anger about the war to end wars, which had not been a war to end wars after all. And so it was a bogus war to end wars, and it caused the death of the man she loved. So that was something that affected me as a child. My mother also reflected, as I was growing up, on her childhood in the German community of St. Louis. She was very young, but was old enough to be thrown out of the public library of St. Louis at age 5 for the crime of speaking German. This was at the height of the anti-German hysteria. In the book, Blotti says this happened to her niece, but it actually happened to my mother. My grandfather also was compelled to sign a loyalty oath. He was a German immigrant, compelled to sign a loyalty oath during the First World War because he had served in the German army in the 19th century during peacetime. So he was quite bitter about Woodrow Wilson, whom he felt had betrayed the cause of peace. And so my grandfather voted for Eugene Debs in 1920 in protest of that. Now, all of these are stories I learned as a child, not in bitterness really, but they're part of the family history, and so I grew up knowing about them. And then I became a history major in college, and so studied the history and learned about the history of the First World War and the role of the Lusitania, political role of the Lusitania, and bringing us into that war, and so I was interested in that even at the time. It's also the case that I grew up in the west side of New York City, not too far from the Lusitania's actual birth. And so I knew the site, I knew the streets, and I knew the social geography of the region, and the Italian and Irish immigrants who principally lived there, well, their kids were my playmates when I was growing up. So it all came together for me. The story of Elliot Huff, the immigrant background of my grandparents, growing up on the west side of New York, the history major, it all came together and produced this book.